thank you everyone for giving up some time on your Thursday night to join Sam and I for this chat. We're pretty excited. This is one of our first live author chats, so bear with me. I'm still learning the technology and we've had a pretty crazy old day on the Gold Coast, so we'll see how I hold up by the end of it. But my name's Peter and I'm one of the Program Development Officers at Gold Coast Libraries, and I'd really like to welcome Sam and thank her for joining us tonight. Before we start though, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the people of the Yugambeh language region, both past and present, and to all the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people who live here today. So thank you. We're going to start, Sam's going to tell us a little bit about herself and about her books. We are here to talk about Hollow Empire, which is her new release, and we're really excited about that. But it does follow on from an earlier book, City of Lies, so I'll let Sam talk to a bit of that. So I'd like to, if anyone's got any questions along the way, please pop those in the chat function, and we will. I'm going to keep sort of track of those, and at the end of the session we'll have a little chat with Sam can answer your questions. So yeah, please feel free to have a chat. But I'll throw over to you now, Sam. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Peter, and hi everyone. It's lovely to be here virtually.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you said, I'm Sam Hawke. I'm a fantasy writer. My first book, City of Lies, came out a few years ago, and the sequel, Hollow Empire, has just been released in the last few weeks. So what I thought we'd do is I'd just chat a little bit about my books and the kind of things that I was trying to explore with them, and then we might, yeah, Peter and I will have a chat, and you guys can ask any questions that you had. Some of you might have read the first book, City of Lies, but I'm going to try to keep my discussion mostly spoiler-free, given that the books are basically mysteries. So I will try not to ruin anything. So City of Lies was a story about a brother and sister whose family are poison tasters. They're responsible for protecting the ruling family of a very wealthy and sophisticated city. And at the beginning of the story, basically everything goes to crap for them. So their uncle, who's the current poison tester, and the chancellor that they're meant to be protecting are poisoned by a previously unknown poison. And then the city is besieged by a mysterious army of what seems to be the country's own people. So my main characters basically have to try to find the traitor who poisoned their uncle and work out the reasons for the rebellion before the new chancellor, who is their childhood best friend, is murdered as well, or the city falls. So these books are kind of my homage to some of the things I always loved reading growing up. Fantasy settings with mysterious and poorly understood magic, closed room mysteries, siblings and friendship, and characters who are more the Sam Gamgees than the centre stage actors of the story. So Hollow Empire, which is out now just in time for Christmas, is the sequel. And again, I'll try to be conscious of spoilers and just say it follows the same cast of characters several years later. And this time my brother-sister duo are trying to protect the Chancellor from assassins and witches and criminal gangs while the city's in the midst of hosting effectively the Fantasy Olympics. So more suspense and more mystery, and my poor main characters scrambling to save the day when they'd really probably just prefer a cup of tea. So I thought I'd talk you through a few things which maybe I won't say unique to my work because there's lots of other great examples out there, but at least sort of distinct about it. The sort of books they are and the themes or ideas that I was trying to explore. So first up, they're not super fantasy stories. So they're set in a different world to ours, but they're relatively low magic. I'm a firm believer that fantasy is a setting more than a genre. So fantasy stories can be adventure stories, coming of age stories, they can be literary, they can be crime, they can be mystery, they can be romances or even westerns. So while I've always gravitated to fantasy settings, the actual stories you can tell in that context, I think, are basically unlimited. And a lot of fantasy uses a mystery structure because people, well, definitely me, like puzzles. We like to be surprised, and we like strategically withheld information and that feeling of working something out just before characters do. And we love tension. And these are all things that the mystery genre does really well. So when I was a kid, a lot of my favorite books were obviously fantasy. They were ones with a supernatural bent. Initially, they tended to be stories set in our own world, but with some magical or otherworldly elements. So I loved The Little Prince, or When Marnie Was There, Space Demons and Megan Starr. And then eventually someone put me onto The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And, you know, I discovered full secondary world fantasy, and that turned out to be, you know, exactly what I wanted. But at the same time, I was always really into mysteries as well. So Enid Blyton style ones when I was younger, and Nancy Drew, but also things like the Calendar Papers, which was all about family secrets and leaned very heavily into the who can you trust feeling. And probably most significantly, my grandmother's collection of Alistair MacLean post-war spy novels. So, you know, if you think The Guns of Navarone was an unsuitable choice for a 10-year-old, well, too late. I devoured those books over and over again, probably at a grossly inappropriate age. But I think it was really from them that I learned the most about pacing and tension and suspense and unreliable narrators. So like Fear is the Key is a really spectacular example of an unreliable narrator and how to withhold information from the reader and completely upend their understanding of the story partway through. Night Without End is basically just a perfect closure of mystery with a ticking clock and a group full of suspects, all of whom are lying about something. And these sort of feelings of ramping up tension and having characters learn things that upend their understanding of the people around them in the world. And just that sense that everyone has their secrets and their stories and working out who you can trust. Anyway, those are all things I tried to import into my little fantasy story about trying to find a poisoner while you're trapped with them in a besieged city. So another thing I tried to do differently to maybe some fantasy is to center characters who aren't the standard fantasy archetypes. So, you know, I love knights and assassins and mages and stuff as much as the next person. But what I've always really adored most in fantasy are stories about characters who aren't the obvious heroes. Like I said earlier, the Sam Gamgees, the sidekicks of the story. And in my case, I wrote two main protagonists who aren't fighters, who aren't magic users, who aren't particularly powerful at all, and who largely have to solve problems through reasoning rather than the use of force or special powers. Jovan, the brother, is a specialist in the study of poisons and how to detect them, but he's also got OCD or something very like it, which presents him with some challenges. And Kalina, his sister, has a chronic illness which prevented her from being properly trained in poison tasting because her body couldn't take the strain of, you know, being gradually poisoned over her life. But she's instead been used as something of a spy, learning about threats through observation of other people. Another notable thing about the characters and the world building in the Poison Wars is that I really tried to deliberately center that sibling relationship between Jovan and Kalina, and also their friendship with the Chancellor Tane. That triangle of relationships and all the underlying tensions and complications, and ultimately their deep love and loyalty to each other is kind of the heart of the story. And I really love sibling bonds, and I love seeing them in fiction, and platonic friendships as well. And I think they're underused in fantasy. I wish we saw more of them. So not only did I want to make the core of the characters in my book, I also wanted to make it a core value in the broader world that I built around them. So Solasta, the setting of both books, is a city in which sibling relationships are one of the most prioritized and valued. The people don't grow up and leave their family home. They stay with their blood or adopted family, and that's their core group. That's the village with whom women raise their children. That's how money and property and social power transfers and accumulates, not through romantic relationships. So there's no marriage in Solasta. I made that decision for a number of reasons. First, because, as I said, I wanted to showcase sibling and family and friendship bonds, but also because it's a low magic fantasy, it's one of the ways in which I could make the world feel distinctly different from ours without, you know, having magical stuff everywhere and dragons and things. You know that you're somewhere very different immediately in the story because of how different the family relationships and politics are structured. And it also let me tell a story in which gender roles aren't based around the patriarchy. And you'd think this would be more common in fantasy because, you know, secondary worlds are a blank slate. But it's surprising how often we can tell like the most imaginative stories with magical creatures and powers and, you know, these fictional magical places, but then we just regurgitate the same modern Western nuclear family structure and gender politics. And look, don't get me wrong, you can tell a lot of important stories that examine gender by having characters be outsiders or insiders who push against the status quo. And it's a real opportunity to help readers think through their own cultural assumptions or see themselves reflected in a different world. And of course, there's a long tradition of fantasy stories featuring female protagonists who long to sort of escape the shackles of the roles society's put on them. So, you know, the Eowyns and Alanas and Arya Starks are kind of well-established feature in the genre, although probably less common are their male counterparts who, you know, are striving for the freedom to engage in what Western society sees as more feminized pursuits. Probably the earliest example I can remember reading is of a story like that was Vaniel in the Mercedes Lackey Last Herald Mage books. It's not as common. But, you know, modern fantasy offers really nuanced takes and a chance to explore the effects of fixed gender assumptions on people who don't fit within the cishet mold, and the structures that are built around. And the genre is full of really wonderful examples that can sort of turn a mirror on our own understanding of gender politics. But I didn't want to write about the conflicts inherent in real world scenarios, and I wanted to explore a world entirely without them. So, you know, fantasy gives us the power and the permission to start at the beginning and say, wait, but why? Or why not? In my case, I wanted to play with our assumptions about family structures, and particularly how they intersect with romantic relationships. So real history is full of examples of conflicts which essentially arise out of the patriarchy. Women being blamed for fertility issues, even though, dudes, it's your fault at least half the time. Yeah, a child's social value being determined by reference to the social rank and importance of the father. Value judgments about the acceptability and respectability of particular relationships, namely heterosexual marriage over others, and critically inherent uncertainty about the identity of fathers, which creates risks for women. These sort of factors have underpinned a lot of the cultural baggage that Western societies carry about gender and acceptable behaviours, and I basically didn't want a bar of it. There's enough toxic masculinity in the real world, and I didn't want to create a fictional mirror of that. So yeah, City sort of asks questions like, you know, if we were socialised to treat our immediate relatives as our village to parent our children, then the identity of the father of the child inherently diminishes. So what would happen then? Would the value that society places on establishing long-term couple relationships likewise diminish? What would a society without marriage, without expectation that children leave their family home as adults look like? And how might that have developed, and what would it change about how we treat each other, and particularly in relation to how we treat each other with regard to gender and sexuality? So like, I had a lot of fun with this as a world building exercise, and it gave me the society as a backdrop that I wanted for my brother-sister protagonist. It's not the point of the story, it's just there as part of the world. And fantasy kind of gives us the freedom to write a book which is about poison and treachery and old magic, in which it just happens that women are judged by their skills and talents as equal humans and not their value relative to a man. And in that world, it's such an obvious baseline that it doesn't need to be a plot point. Imagine that. Another thing that felt really important to me in writing these books was to keep my eye on the overall feel and to make sure that they lean towards optimism. So there was a real peak in the kind of early 2000s of what we call Grimdark. I don't know if you guys all know the term, but it's not a fixed definition, but essentially Grimdark fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that has an ultimately pessimistic view of the world and of human nature. So in Grimdark, the world around the characters is often irredeemably bad and dark and violent and hopeless, without any real sense that it could get better. And protagonists themselves are often morally grey, and characters in the story generally, and particularly those making really, you know, world-affecting decisions, are kind of assumed to have a core of selfishness and greed that ultimately means even if you've got good people as protagonists, the world's kind of terrible anyway. And Grimdark is often praised or defended for its realism, and it can be very good, well-written stuff as well. Game of Thrones is a good example because its entire premise sort of centered around essentially terrible people, and the characters who try to make kind or moral decisions in the books tend to die horribly or have their goodness stamped out of them, with a kind of inevitable sense that things are just awful and people are awful. And Grimdark can be funny even. Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy has a series of point of view characters who are largely also terrible people making bad decisions. And they're brilliant books. They're really engaging and entertaining, but you do sort of come away with a general feeling a bit worse about everything. So there was a real period there where there was a sort of peak of Grimdark popularity and lots of much worse examples flooding the genre. And look, I read and enjoyed a lot in the genre, but sort of in the last decade, I've very much swung away from looking for snarky, morally grey, dubious sort of heroes and that kind of edgy, dark aesthetic. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I don't mind being emotionally crushed, don't get me wrong. Indeed, some of my favourite books are the ones that have made me cry the most, but I don't want to be beaten down by my fiction so that I feel worse about the world and people and certain that evil in the end will slowly take us all over. So I think this trend kind of away from Grimdark in recent times probably reflects how the readership is feeling about the world around us. So, you know, so many terrible things have happened and there are so many huge global concerns about where we are and where we're headed as a species, you know, climate change and poverty and increasing wealth gap and the rise of right-wing governments across many world powers, which celebrate the kind of worst, nasty, selfish, greedy aspects of our humanity. It's hard, and especially as a parent, not to be frightened about the future we're leaving our children. And with that sense of frustration and concern in the real world, I think a lot of people, certainly me, are not really into seeing these things echoed without challenge in our fiction, which is why I think more optimistic fantasy has grown in popularity in recent years. And I will say without challenge is the important part there. As in, I'm not saying that fantasy should be utopias, although I only want to read stories which kind of skirt away from hard issues and darkness, where it's all flowers and light and nothing serious is happening. You know, Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings are my favourite books of all time, and they are, especially the Fifth trilogy, in places unbearably sad. But the books themselves never feel grim, because while they recognise and explore the ways that people are messy and change is hard and terrible things do happen, they don't sort of carry the underlying message that we should just shrug our shoulders and accept it. There's always the sense that characters are trying for something better and trying to be better, and that's not a hopeless or pointless goal, or worse, one worth mocking. Which sort of segues into the last thing I wanted to mention, which is sort of what fantasy can offer us in times of global uncertainty and danger. The obvious answer is that when the world's a bit of a hellscape, and I think we can all agree this particular year has been a lot on many fronts, there's an appeal to spending time away from that in a fictional world, one that preferably doesn't have poisonous air from bushfires, or a pandemic, or those murder wasps we had briefly in July, or Donald Trump. It says a lot that it feels relaxing to be in a fantasy world when these are usually worlds full of conflict and turmoil and war and oppression and dark overlords, but they're also usually worlds of possibility and of wonder and of magic. And there's probably some part of all of us that still hungers after that sensation we had as children, first devouring stories and escaping into different worlds. But I just think it's important to note that fantasy isn't just about escapism or forgetting our problems. Fantasy is also a way of looking at our own world. And sometimes something that seems to make no sense presents itself with clarity when you put it in a different context, a different light, a different kind of background. So to me, fantasy is the oldest kind of fiction storytelling, not because it's meant to make people forget about the real world, but because it's meant to illuminate it. There are questions and issues that are really thorny and difficult to talk about and think about in a real world context, but which when presented in a fantasy story can be interrogated at will. For example, although in some ways a lot of fantasy can be a bit nostalgic for monarchy and some other kind of simplistic ideas, it's also a genre where you see some really interesting discussions of power structures, who has power and who can use it. And a really consistent theme in fantasy is providing a facsimile of power, represented by magic, and granting it to an oppressed or marginalized person, be that by way of poverty or religion or social class. A great recent example that I've read is Alex Harrow's Once and Future Witches, which is set in a sort of alternate Earth in which women's power is interrogated by linking the suffrage movement to witchcraft, so that the three sisters who are the subject of the story are simultaneously caught up in a battle to reclaim magic as well as to gain voting rights. So in fantasy, you don't have to be subtle with your metaphor. You can just lay it all out on the page. Ultimately, humans learn through stories, and we tell stories to overcome the seeming randomness and indifference of the world. And we tell stories to make things possible, to realize that change can happen. And when we experience a story that maps out with experiences in our own life, we can see how we might make different or better choices in our own lives, which is also the reason why I want to tell optimistic stories. You know, bad things do happen. They're called the poison wars, and they start with like the character's most beloved parental figure and teacher and the person their entire family is charged with protecting being horribly murdered. And the whole first book is set in a besieged city. There's definitely violence and sadness and danger. And I'm not trying to sell a story that the good guys always win and everything is always going to be fine. But being optimistic the way I see it is about writing characters who want to do better and who make mistakes and have blind spots and regrets and flaws, but are ultimately striving to be better people living in a better world. And that's hopeful. That teaches readers something too about resisting darkness and indifference. There's something that it's something you can do, something you should do, even when, or maybe especially when, things out in the broader world look bad. That's what fantasy can give us.
Thank you, Sam. That's great. Those are lots of good things to think about there, and I've written down a few notes, but we've got some questions there, so I might throw to some of those. Maddie, thank you. You've been giving us lots of great questions there. So we'll, Maddie's first question was, did anything particular inspire the siege element in City of Lies?
Well, I wanted to write a closed room mystery. So I wanted to be able to have a cast of characters where you knew one of them was the baddie, and you had to sort of solve from the clues who was lying and so on. And one of the ways that I wanted to do that was to obviously prevent people from leaving. So you knew that the baddie was still with them, basically. And so, given I was setting it in a city, the idea I had was to put it in a besieged city so that there was no chance of anyone getting in or out without it being a big plot deal. I think I don't know whether it was inspired by, or whether, sometimes these ideas are all sort of smooshed together in your head, so it's not really clear. But I definitely got a lot of the world building feel from of what it would be like to be under a siege by walking the walls of medieval cities in Europe on a big trip that my husband and I took. And I just got a real sense of the sort of scale of being up on those walls and the height and breadth and depth of them, and seeing all of the old tricks and traps that people used to do to keep people out of cities in times of siege. But yeah, I mean, I think it was largely a choice of convenience to allow me to tell the mystery story that I wanted to tell. Oh no, you're going to give. I'm looking at these questions. I'm
Got some there?
give me quizzes. Oh no. Sorry. when I get put on the spot with questions like which famous people would I want in a siege, my default mode tends to be my brain just starts making panicked white noise. So I apologise if my answers to any of these questions.
No, that's all right. It's just top of your head. I could probably answer for me, but we're not terribly literary. It might be famous rock stars as well, and
famous people.
We can come back to that one. Yeah. Maybe literary heroes. Who knows?
Well, are they real people or fake people?
Yeah, Maddie, do you want to? I think it was Maddie's question. Do you want to?
I'm sure there's lots of fantasy characters who'd be lots of use in a siege. I don't know how many real world people would be that useful in a siege.
Yeah, Jon Snow. I'd have him in my.
You'd want some very clever people, wouldn't you?
Yes.
You might want to just quickly check Cyro and look at some of their top scientists, pop them in the siege with you. Military strategists.
I think some of your characters.
I don't know if modern military strategists would be that cool in a siege now.
Well,
I'm useless at these questions.
No, well, I think some of I'd take your characters certainly, Joan and Kalina. Absolutely, they use the smarts, and they've been amazing with what they accomplished in that book. So, yep, that'd be on my team for sure.
Someone who can go a really long period of time without eating good food would be useful. Someone who doesn't lose their head in a crisis.
Maddie's saying it wasn't meant to be precious, so let's not stress about that. But thank you, Maddie. It's one of those ones that you'll, in the middle of the night, you're going to wake up and go,
yeah, I'm really good at thinking of answers afterwards.
Me too.
I'm just hopeless. Someone asked me on the radio the other day, I can't remember what the question was, but it was something along those lines, like top 5 or something. Yeah. It was like my brain just started emitting panic noise. I don't even know what I said.
Maddie's also asked about if you had another job other than an author, what would it be? But I do know that you do have another job. You write and you're a lawyer. Is that right?
I am. Yeah, I'm a practicing lawyer. Yeah, I didn't mean to become a lawyer. Well, I sort of meant to become a lawyer when I was younger. I think because I was very argumentative. Someone told me once that I ought to be a lawyer because I was very. I was the kind of student who talked back a fair bit, and I think someone sort of offhandedly said I should be a lawyer. So I think I just sort of pinned that. I don't even know where it came from, but I had a very early and I must admit accurate view of how sort of financially viable it would be to be a writer, which is to say not financially viable at all. Somehow even teenage me understood that already.
Yeah.
So I never sort of thought that I'd be a writer who didn't have to have another job. And so I guess I always just saw I will have one sensible, financial, stable job, and then I will have the writing. And yeah, I went to law school and quickly figured out I didn't want to be a lawyer. Like many people at law school do. And I was going to be a tax accountant, actually. And then by a series of largely random events, I ended up in a legal job anyway. And yeah, I mean, inertia just kept me there. I thought, well, I guess I'm a lawyer now. And then it turned out a few years later that I found my way into the one area of law that I actually really love. So I work in government and I do statutory interpretation and constitutional law, which is essentially English comprehension. You know, I'm not the kind of lawyer who, you know, goes to court or does contracts or like anything useful for your friends and family. I'm no use whatsoever to anybody because all I do is kind of sit in it. All I do is sit in an office and write legal advice about like really old statutes, which is largely an exercise, as I said, in English comprehension, just trying to work out like what old punctuation means in the context. So it's actually exactly my jam. And if I'd known that was not the kind of job you know exists when you're a teenager or even at law school, I didn't really know that that was a job you could do. And I really just genuinely found my way into it by accident. And it turned out to be very well suited for my skill set and my personality type. So it's an office full of like clever nerds who sit in their offices quietly and write things and make a lot of cake. So yeah, I did want to be, if I was going to choose any other job, I wanted to be a zookeeper for quite a while. But unfortunately, personally, I looked into it and it's really hard to become a zookeeper. You have to do like, there's basically no jobs. Like there's only a handful of jobs around the country. It's really competitive because heaps of people,
a lot of people want to do it.
Think, it sounds like a great job. I love animals. I don't mind doing like picking up crap. But also the sun is my natural enemy.
I hear you.
Which is a problem. So being outdoors all the time, I'm also like highly allergic to most of nature. So like I try to be a person who is in nature, but nature doesn't like me very much. So I burn immediately, and you know, sneeze and stuff. So being outdoors all the time is probably not viable, even if I get a job. So
they're pretty.
I'll stick with the law. Your
books are fairly, you know, they're sizable. So how do you go with that writing and managing a job? They are chunky. Yeah, I have. I've been holding up City of Lies for a while and it's heavy.
You can, if you don't like reading fantasy, they make an excellent weapon. Sizable chunk to whack someone on the head or an attractive doorstop.
So that's surely, how do you manage both?
I think the answer is, and I've said this before, but the answer is I just feel like I do everything quite badly. Just sort of stumble along at you know, attempting to be a parent, and I teach jiu-jitsu and you know, do my day job and attempt to write the books. And yeah, it just largely feels like I'm failing at everything all the time. But,
not failing, that books.
It all gets done in the end.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I've discovered I'm probably an inherently lazy person trapped in a busy, productive person's life. Sometimes just pounding uselessly at the wall, saying, "Let me be lazy." Yeah.
And we've got Sophia's asked too, what are your 5 essential ingredients of world building?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So I think world building in order to work for me, has to feel organic to the story. So it has to be, you have to learn about the world through the eyes of the character, and the things that you learn about the world should be things that are natural to what the character is experiencing. So when people say they don't like info dumps in fantasy, it's usually because the information being conveyed is not information that feels natural to the moment in the story, because it's something you're trying to tell the reader instead of the character experiencing. So the best world building to me feels natural in that way. For me, I like world building that doesn't just, as I was talking about before, it doesn't just recycle every assumption that we make about how power structures work and societies work, but actually kind of consciously makes decisions about which things you pick up from the real world. So good world building is being aware of what choices that you make, and obviously there's a certain amount of choices there's a certain amount of differences you can take without making it too hard for the readers, right? You have to use a certain element of familiarity so that it doesn't feel alien and sort of push people away. So you have to have things that people relate to, but you want enough different elements that it feels, you know, transportive. So you feel like you're somewhere else. And yeah, I think making the choices about which are the bits that you tweak and change and which are the bits that you copy are that doing that consciously makes for good world building, I think. I don't know how many I'm up to now. I like world building. I like world building that kind of feels like it matches sort of geographically where you are. So I like world building that feels like every element of the culture is driven by where the people are or where they came from. So you can see that sort of there've been, again, kind of thoughtful choices about the, you know, foods and sports and entertainment and stuff that the culture has used. So like a really neglected part of world building, actually, sports. I bloody love sports. I'm going to put that on my list of top 5 because, again, it's something that's missing in a lot of fantasy, and it shouldn't be, because like people love sports. Historically, every society we've ever had has had its versions of sports.
Yeah.
People love playing them. We always do it. And they just seem to be like missing from heaps of fantasy, and I like seeing them there. You know, because people do have recreation time, and I think one of the traps that people fall into in fantasy stories is like focusing on only world building that's sort of cool and mysterious and interesting to the world, but forgetting that like everyday people have everyday needs.
Society,
yeah, like things like sport are really underrepresented. Like news dissemination, like how people communicate news and information to each other between cities and within cities and so on. Like things like that make worlds feel really real to me. Yeah.
Probably because they're also busy fighting battles that they've got no energy for sport. Maybe
well, that's right.
Maybe
like,
that's
peppered in so that
totally.
The world feels like it exists other than in a state of crisis, I guess.
And the kids would be doing it,
Yeah. Right. Oh, and world building. Sorry. I also like to see like broader connections to people rather than just the sort of old style hero's journey where the person's like a solitary lone wolf moving through the world without being bound by, you know, the opinions of their grandparents. And like I like seeing the complications of real life and extended families and, you know, the consequences of all of those things play out in world building and how the characters move through the world. Because it's really convenient to just have a character who's an orphan with no siblings and like no long-term relationships, so they can just do whatever you need them to do in the plot. But I like them to be tangled up in like the real relationships that real people have. And I think that makes the world feel real to me.
And for me, that was one of the beauties of City of Lies, like you're saying, the sibling relationship, but also with Tane, it was a lovely, the dynamic. For me, that was one of the things I loved the most.
That's the most important part of the story for me too.
So Hollow Empire, it's obviously following on from City of Lies. Is there another one in you? Do you I mean, you can't tell us what happens. There's no spoiler alert.
No, well, I don't.
Give us a taste.
It's not up to me. It's not up to me whether there's another one. It will sort of depend on whether the publisher wants to publish another one.
Yeah.
So, you know, certainly I could.
You left it open,
I left it open. So, I mean, both City and Hollow can be read as
standalone.
As a complete story, basically. So, if there's no more, then that's kind of the end of the story, and that'll be fine. But yeah, it was actually quite tough to write a second book in that context, because you don't know at the time of writing whether there's going to have to be more, because, you know, fantasy readers like series. I like series too, and you know, you make all this effort sort of building up a world and a society and these characters that you're so fond of and stuff. So there's a sort of a sense of you'd like to leave it, you'd like to tell more stories about it, but also you have to make sure that it's a complete and satisfying story if that's the end. So I mean, I hope that I've done that with Hollow Empire. So you should be able to read Hollow Empire and be like, well, ideally I'd like you to be satisfied if that's the end, but also wanting more.
I do. I'm wanting to know what's happening in these relationships moving forward, so I'm looking forward to it. Sophie has also answered a question, just we can sort of just commenting on your beautiful bookshelf at the back, which I must admit I have incredible envy of as well. So with summer coming up and summer reading, are you planning on getting some done, and what are you looking forward to reading over the summer?
I have so many great books on the pile, which many of which aren't out yet. And one of the best things about being an author is being able to get your hands on these books early.
Did you hear that, jealous? Oh,
sorry. It is the best though. So I'm about to finish. I will finish tonight probably. Tasha Suri's Jasmine Throne, which will be out in, I think, March, April-ish next year. And it's amazing. It's so good.
Okay.
I in heart, so that's my electronic read at the moment. Not within sight, but I'm reading the hard copy of Kate Elliott's Unconquerable Sun, which is a gender-bent Alexander the Great in space story.
Wow.
Really, I mean, Kate Elliott is a good one. You should write. That's what I'm reading at the moment. And I've got to start a new audiobook actually. With COVID, I've had like way less commuting time. So I was listening to audiobooks a lot last year and the year before. And in fact, probably I was listening to more audiobooks than anything else because I could actually get them done. But I haven't got one on the fly at the moment. So I'll need to. But so yeah, I'm looking forward to those ones. I've got Marina Losteta's The Helm of Midnight, which is like a serial killer novel set in a fantasy setting, coming up. Everina Maxwell's Winter's Orbit, which is another space opera. They're both on my pile next after I finish Jasmine Throne. There's so many good books coming out next year, though, honestly. You guys should read She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, because that'll be out mid next year, and it's a kind of fantasy retelling of the founding of the Ming Dynasty in sort of 14th century China. It's really amazing. And E.J. Beaton's The Counsellor, these are both by Australian authors, by the way. E.J. Beaton's The Counselor is coming out even earlier. It's very political fantasy and probably got a lot of similar elements to mine in the sense that it's a lot of mystery and suspense and intrigue. And then Freya Marsk's A Marvellous Light, which is completely different, and it's sort of a Victorian magic hijinks gay romance, basically, and it's loads of fun, coming out at the end of the year. Freya is an amazing writer. She's also from Canberra. So there's a few Australian authors to look out for. And I did recommend earlier Once and Future Witches, which is so good.
And I think
Cara was annoyingly talented.
Maddie's added that to her list.
Oh yeah, I can see that, Maddie. Yeah, and also look out for her. She's done like it's a novella coming out with Tor.com, I think. I can't think what it's called. Spindle's End, maybe. Anyway, it's a Rapunzel in a Spider-Verse kind of story. Wow. So it's got lots of Rapunzel. It's really cool, really fun.
Clever.
That's coming out too. Sorry, that's a lot of books.
It's great. Everyone's going to look at this. The holds are going to be going crazy. Everyone's going to be keeping an eye out. But thank you. So you've got a fantasy Christmas list there, everybody, and lots to look forward to.
And if I want to go into mysteries, sorry, I think there's a new Stuart McBride coming out, and he is a great mystery writer. If you want to read some crime, I highly recommend.
Is there anything more you want to tell us about the new release before we wrap things up? We're probably
I don't know. I mean, you should buy 40, 50 copies each.
Absolutely. Really good Christmas presents, and then you've really got to buy
it's a complete series in that you can give it to all those people who say they don't want to start new series because they're worried that people won't finish them. Well, it's a complete story. You can read it now. It's good value for money, page count wise. Very
absolutely. It's impressive under a tree, that one too. It's a good, good size. But no, look, I'm really proud of it, and people who've read it seem to enjoy it as much, or if not more than City. So I'd love you to give it a try. Definitely. Well, as I said, Sam and I had a little chat prior to actually recording this, but I would have said perhaps fantasy is not a genre that I sort of pick up first, but I, in preparation for this, read the book and I loved it. And I've already got the next one ready to go, lined up, and I'm really excited to read that. And for me, it's as much the characters and the relationships. And like we you were talking about the various layers with the gender and the race and the environment and the politics and the intrigue. There was so much to it, and I loved it. So thank you.
The second one definitely has a focus on parenthood as well. Okay. If that is something you're interested in. Because Jove has to take on an apprentice in the second book, and grapple with trying to be a parent to a teenage girl while also poisoning her repeatedly. Of
course, carrying on the tradition. Yeah. Okay. Oh, look. there's all the tasters. We're ready to go. So we should let you get going. But
Well, thank you so much for having me.
do you know, I had a spiel and I was just so excited. I've launched straight into my, and missed my intro about Sam. She has won so many awards for City of Lies, and I really should. I should have started with this. So apologies, everyone. But can I just say that City of Lies did come out in 2018 and it won the Aurelius Award for Best Fantasy Novel. You've won the Ditmar Award for Best Novel and the Nora K. Hemi Award for Excellence in Exploring Issues of Gender, Race, Disability and Class. And you were longlisted for the British Science Fiction Awards. So that, and City of Lies was your debut, wasn't it? So that was for that. So that's probably, you know, a tough gig to live up to for the next one. No pressure there.
That's true. That's true. I have a trophy shelf now.
You really? You're gonna have to make room on that bookshelf really, for all your trophies.
No, they're on the. I've got bookshelves on the opposite side of me as well, so I'm also facing bookshelves.
Oh my goodness.
All of those awards were legitimately not expected at all. In fact, so much so that like I didn't go to the Aurealis ceremony because I really couldn't justify flying all the way to Melbourne for something I thought there was no way I was going to win. And then very embarrassingly, my lovely friend Devon Madsen, who was also on the list, said that she'd pick up the award for me on the off chance that I won. And she told me to write a speech in case I won, and I did it. And then I was texting. I've got a series of texts for the poor thing as my husband and I were sitting in bed drinking wine and watching the live stream.
Celebrating.
No, but not celebrating, just watching. And then she had to get up and she gave a speech for me while I was oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Put you on the spot.
No, anyway, she's amazing.
Well, so, you know, it's a testament to the, you know, to the standard that it is. So as I said, I'm really looking forward to Hollow Empire and excited
to enjoy it.
To follow the journey. I can't wait.
Thank you so much for delving into not your favorite genre.
Well, that's it. And look at me go now. So next time someone comes in looking to my library looking for a fantasy, you're it. So awesome. Thank you everyone
for joining, for coming.
Yeah, for your questions, they were wonderful, and yes. Yeah, as I said, highly recommend, and really appreciate you giving up your time. And yeah, thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, and yeah, come and see us soon. Thank you.
Stay safe. Merry Christmas.
Bye. Bye. You too. See ya.